right, so for this video lecture, we're going to continue on with the cardiovascular system. There are two things that you should have with you. There is a packet that was titled Cardiac Cycle, and so that is the packet that you will want to take notes on. And then there was also a loose sheet that you guys would have picked up that talks about the classification of blood vessels. And so have that with you as well as we move through this particular conversation. So the first week that we met together, we talked a lot about the location of the heart and kind of the structure of the heart, blood flow through the heart, and things of that nature. Today we're going to get into a little bit more of the actual heartbeat, which we did start or touch on last time, and then we're going to get into blood components and then talking about the blood vessels. So when we look at the cardiac cycle, looking at one heartbeat from start to finish, and I mentioned last time that this is an electrical impulse. So you're getting that information from your brain down to the heart when that heartbeat should be happening. But within the heart, you have to have a series of events take place to actually carry out the heartbeat. So when we look at what that information is telling us, and if I ask you guys to think about the heartbeat, you've all seen that drawing with the little spikes going up and down. There's actually a lot of information that is held within those peaks and valleys of a heartbeat that can tell a doctor or anybody looking at that exactly what is going on with the heart. And so those peaks and valleys are very, very important information. So there are three main parts to that heartbeat. So in that initial reading, you would see a first small little wave up, and that is what we call the P wave. And then you're going to see a much larger peak in the middle, and that is called the QRS wave. So the bottom part of that peak is the Q, the top is the R, and then where it comes back down is the S portion of that. So that middle one is going to actually have 3 points of reference. And then the last one that we have after the big peak of the heartbeat, you'll have a little bit of a downturn and then one small more peak at the end. And that is what we know as the T wave. So you have three big things happening within one heartbeat. And the first two coincide with what we talked about in the first class. And it's why I wanted to somewhat introduce the heartbeat with the first conversation that we had, because I knew we were going to be tying and coming back to it with this conversation. So we talked about the SA and the AV nodes, and the SA node is in the top of the right atrium and the AV node is at the bottom of the right atrium. When that electrical impulse comes to the top of the heart and hits that SA node, it's going to move through those fibers around the top two chambers of the heart, causing them to contract. Meanwhile, that impulse is continuing to travel down to the AV node, hits that lower one, and those fibers are going to be threaded through the bottom two chambers of the heart, and they cause the second part of the heartbeat to happen. So when we look at the heartbeat, those peaks and valleys, that first small little peak that you would get, the P wave, is what is actually happening when the atria goes through its contraction. So you're actually getting a reading of that part of the heart muscle contracting, and that's what's going to cause that first peak. The second thing that happens is now that electrical current travels down to the AV node, we have the lower part of the heart going through its contraction, and that's going to provide that second wave. Now, the reason that you get such a distinction between the two, where the first one is small and the second one is much more pronounced, is because of the structure of the heart. The atria are much thinner in nature as far as the muscle walls than the ventricles, the bottom two chambers of the heart. And the reason for that is, if you think about where the blood is going, when the blood is in those top two chambers, when the heart beats, it only has to move the blood from the top two chambers down to the ventricles. It doesn't have to push the blood that far. So those muscles don't need to be nearly as strong because the blood is not moving that far. But the blood that's in the ventricles, when the heart beats, that blood, if it's in your ventricles, is going to be pushed out to somewhere in the body. It's either going out to your lungs or it's getting dispersed out to your head, neck, torso, legs, and being moved through your entire system. Because the blood is getting pushed much further when it's getting forced out of the ventricles, those muscle walls around the bottom two chambers of your heart have to be much, much thicker to be able to pump with enough force to get that blood to move. And so that is going to explain why that first peak in your heartbeat is much lower, because it's coming from the atria, thinner muscles, doesn't have to push with as much force. The second part of that heartbeat is coming from the ventricle walls, and now we're pushing with a lot more force, and you're going to see that with a much higher peak reading in that heartbeat. The final part of that is the T wave. And remember, this is an electrical impulse, so you have positive and negative charges that are moving through the muscle, heart muscle, to get the contraction to actually happen. And for that reason, when the heartbeat is done or finishing up, all of those positive and negatives, they have to go back and get ready for the next heartbeat. And so that last little down peak and then into a small bump at the end, that is just showing all of those ions, those positive and those negative charges, getting reset to get ready and prepared for the next heartbeat. So the first one, that's reading what the atria are doing. The second one is reading what the ventricles are doing. And then that third part of the heartbeat is just showing you everything getting realigned, as getting ready for the next electrical current that is going to come. So a lot of information that is held within that heartbeat. The second slide that you have on page 1 there talks about the electrical impulse, goes back to the SA node and the AV node. And we did cover that, but I wanted to come back to it and put it with that first slide just as a reminder. But we did already talk through that information last class. So you can go ahead and flip over to page 2 of your packet. And on page 2, it gets into some of the abnormalities that can happen within a heartbeat. So if somebody is experiencing a heartbeat that is not what we would consider, what we would not consider to be normal, so much higher than 60 to 70 beats per minute when you're at rest, gets into some of these arrhythmias. So probably one of the most common ones, if you look there, the second one, the tachycardia, that is just simply a rapid heartbeat. And when you look at that particular one, what you would notice looking at that heartbeat is that you don't have any flat line. Typically, when you hear about flat lines, that's not a good thing, but in a normal heart rhythm, you're going to have a flat line between each one of the heartbeats. So you would have the heartbeat, and then it would go straight, and then you would have the next heartbeat. And the reason that that's important is because of something called refractory period. You can't, or you don't ever want your heart to have a cramp. We get muscle cramps all the time. You've had them in your calf, you get them, when you overwork yourself. We can't have a cramp happen within the heart muscle, and so it had to be designed in a very specific way that we could prevent a cramp from ever happening. And so the heart muscle does have some unique features. Back in our muscle chapter, we talked about the intercalated discs that you have between the heart muscle cells, which really work to help prevent the possibility of having a cramp within the heart muscle. That recovery period that you have, that flat line between your heartbeats, that is going to help prevent those heart cramps or muscle cramps from happening as well. And so when you get into tachycardia, where you get that rapid heartbeat, the heartbeats are happening so close together that you don't get that flat line period. And the heart is just having to work a lot harder than it should. You also have bradycardia. I know it's not on here, but that is when the heartbeat is too slow. So for our purposes, those are the two that we really need to focus on the most, or that we need to talk about. We do have an activity that I would also like to bring into class. I'm hoping that we have enough time next time that we can work on that also, where you guys would get to look at some different arrhythmias and kind of compare and contrast them to each other. The other two that you have on there, the ventricular fibrillation, um, that you'll notice right away that it just looks like a squiggly line, like a little kid was doodling on a piece of paper. You don't get the distinct, sharp peaks anywhere, and you especially do not get that large one in the middle. And so, looking at that one, it is ventricular fibrillation because you don't have that large, sharp peak at any point. It's telling you that the ventricles are not working the way that they should. The one that you have at the bottom there, again, you see some squiggly lines, but this time you still can pick out those very large waves. So those large peaks, those are your QRS waves. That indicates that the ventricles are pumping the way that they're supposed to. This time, because of that squiggly line, you don't have the very distinct little peaks in there. That is indicating this time that something is wrong with the atrium. So looking at those readings, you can just kind of pick out what part of the heart is causing the problem. If you look at the bottom part of page 2, this gets into our blood discussion. And going back to blood, we've talked on it very briefly, just for the fact that it came up in our connective tissue when we were going through the different tissue types of the body. And blood is considered to be a connective tissue. And that's kind of a stretch for some people because when you talk about connective tissue, a lot of people go to tendons and ligaments and things of that nature, the support structures of our body. But the components that make up blood are derived from the same components that make up the tendons and the ligaments and those types of materials. And so because from embryological development, they all come from the same cells or same types of cells, blood does fall into the category of being a connective tissue. So when we talk about blood, the main goal or the main job of blood is to circulate through the body and make sure that we are delivering oxygen to all of your cells. Now, all of your cells do not have to come in direct contact with a blood vessel. They can diffuse the oxygen that they need from blood vessels as long as they're within 2 millimeters. So they have to be in close proximity and they can still get what they need without having to have direct contact with a blood vessel itself. And that's a very important fact. It doesn't seem like much, but when we're talking about trillions of cells that it takes to make up the human body, if each one of them had to come in direct contact with a blood vessel, we would have far more blood vessels than we do now, and we already have a significant amount. So the ability of your cells to diffuse material back and forth small distances is very huge to allowing us to be more efficient. The other thing that your blood is going to do is it's also going to pick up carbon dioxide. We talked about the fact that nothing works at 100% efficiency. So your cells are tiny little factories. They're doing work all day. They're producing material. And in producing that material, because they're not 100% efficient, they are also producing a waste product, and your cells need to be able to get rid of that. So the oxygen is going to move into your cells, the carbon dioxide, the waste product will move out, and the blood is responsible for then distributing that back to the lungs. You exhale and get rid of that carbon dioxide or that waste product. So those are two of the major jobs. Another big one is for the blood to distribute glucose through your system. Glucose is how your cells start the process of cellular respiration. So your cells are designed to produce ATP. ATP is the fuel for your body to be able to do work. So you eat food, put it into your stomach, you digest it, break it down. Eventually, when that food gets absorbed into your system, into your bloodstream, that blood is now going to distribute that glucose to all the parts of your body so that they can carry out cellular respiration and continue to produce that ATP. The other job that's on there that is one of the important things that we kind of forget about. You really don't hear people mention it too much, but blood is going to play a very significant part in maintaining our body temperature. So when your muscles do work, one of the biggest things that they give off by doing work is heat. And so that heat is then going to need to be distributed to make sure that we stay warm and we maintain that 98.6 degrees. So that heat is going to be kind of absorbed by the bloodstream. Now, because the blood circulates all throughout your body, head to toe, we can help distribute that heat. Now, there are some places of our body that are more susceptible to getting cold, just because when you get down into your fingertips and the tips of your toes, you're not dealing with large blood vessels. You don't have major arteries and veins that are running through those areas. You have tiny little capillaries, and capillaries are about the size of a single strand of hair. So even though you're still getting blood supplied to those areas, because the blood vessels are much finer and smaller, it is much more difficult to keep that heat maintained if you're out in cold for long periods of time. And the last part that you have on that slide just talks about some of the main components that you have within your blood. Red blood cells, your white blood cells, you also have platelets, and then plasma. So red blood cells, biggest thing that they do is they are going to help carry oxygen. They are designed with a molecule called hemoglobin, and hemoglobin basically allows oxygens to latch onto it and distribute it throughout the body. Your white blood cells, these guys are your defenders. So they are a tiny army parading through your body. They hitch a ride on your bloodstream. So again, they're getting distributed through your system all the time, because you never know when and where an infection is going to potentially come into your system. So if you get a scratch or a cut somewhere, you're going to want to make sure that you have white blood cells in that area. And so by streaming through your blood, you can get them to all parts of your body, and they're there and ready for whenever you do get a cut or an opening and your body needs those defenders there. Platelets play a huge role in helping your blood clot. So you have these cells that are in your body. They're called megakaryocytes. 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 And mega indicates big, karyo refers to nucleus, cyte tells you cell. So in their name, they're large nucleated cells. When they die, what actually happens is they're a little bit different than other cells. A lot of times, other cells, when they die off, they're sloughed off in a variety of ways, but these cells are actually going to break. And the best way I can describe it is if you think of a glass plate. If you were to take a glass plate, drop it on the floor, you know that glass plate's going to shatter. And it's not going to shatter in straight pieces. It's going to have jagged edges, sharp edges, and that's exactly what happens to these megakaryocytes. They become fragmented, and they are kept in your blood then, so that when you get an injury and you are bleeding, as blood is leaving that wound, because they have jagged edges, they get trapped and caught in that wound, and they start packing in on top of each other. And as they pack in more and more, they eventually cover that wound or that opening and will help stop the bleeding. So if you have a jagged edge cut, so you get a scrape, fall on the concrete, cut yourself open, that's a jagged cut. Those are going to stop bleeding a lot faster because your skin did not cut nice and clean. That was jagged edges on your skin. It gives those platelets something easier to grab onto. So a jagged cut makes it easier for those jagged platelets to latch on and pack in. A straight edge cut, so if you've ever cut yourself with a razor, it bleeds forever. And that's because it's a straight line cut and it's a clean cut. So those platelets don't have nice jagged edges of skin to grab onto in the first place. It takes them a lot longer to kind of get a hold and then start packing in so that they will stop the bleeding. And then the last one is plasma. That one's coming up here in a little bit, so I'm going to continue to move on over to the next page. So on page 3, you have blood volume and what it's made up of. So if you look at as a whole, and if you want to, I don't know, let me check real fast. So I didn't want to talk ahead on the slide. So when we look at blood volume, for the average female, you're going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 liters worth of blood. For a male, you're going to be closer to 6.5 liters of blood. And that's typically, guys are a little bit taller, so they're going to have a little bit more blood volume than a female. But if you think about a 2 liter bottle, and if you would take two liters and then another 1 liter, that's the total blood volume that you would have in a female body. 3 2-liter bottles side by side by side, that's essentially what you're going to have within a male body. So it does account for, if you look here, it says about 8% of your overall body weight. Within that, 55% of that blood volume is going to be made up of plasma. Plasma is a clear kind of fluid material that you have within the blood. Usually has a little bit of an amber color to it. So it's got a yellowish tint to it. If anybody has donated plasma, you'll notice when they centrifuge it out and separate it, it's not a white liquid. It's actually going to have a little bit, like I said, of that yellow tint to it. Within the plasma itself, it gives you a list of some of the different things that you have in it. Main component is going to be water, so it is a liquid base. But you have things like amino acids, which are the building blocks for proteins. You will also find proteins. You got your carbs, lipids, vitamins. There are some hormones that are also going to be located within that plasma. Electrolytes. Electrolytes are going to be when you have a positively charged element and a negatively charged, and they find each other. That is an electrolyte. And then the last thing is just some waste product. There is some waste material that's going to be collected in that as well. The remaining 45%, and these are averages, is going to be the cell component. So those red blood cells, those white blood cells, and things of that nature. So that is going to be the main material that your blood is composed of. If you drop down to the bottom slide, it starts to talk about red blood cells. Now, red blood cells are kind of the exception to the rule. So we talk about cells and that nice round structure that we all think of cells having, but we do have some exceptions within our body, and the red blood cell is one of those exceptions. So it is round in nature, but it has a unique design, which is called biconcave. So on both sides of your red blood cell, it's actually going to cave in. Kind of looks like somebody took it and pinched it. So it's thinner through the middle than it is around the outside edges. It's not like a donut. There's not a hole in the middle. It's just thinner through the middle. Now, you'll hear me say several times that nothing happens by chance within the human body, and this is very true with the red blood cell. If it has this unique design, there is a very real reason for it. And so with your red blood cells, one of the biggest things that it is tasked with is to carry oxygen throughout your body. So what the red blood cell did is it took every measure it could to be able to maximize exactly how much oxygen it can carry to your cells. You're talking about trillions of cells. So in order to get that job done, you have to make sure that you are being as efficient with all of your red blood cells as you possibly can. So first of all, the red blood cell has that unique design, biconcave, so it dips in through the center. Okay. Again, if you think about this, if you were to draw a straight line, or if you were to measure that dipped line, which one would be longer? The straight line that cuts straight across, or the one that sags and dips down? The one that dips is going to be longer. So by having that biconcave shape, it actually increases the surface area of your red blood cells, which allows it to carry more oxygen. More surface area, more space to put oxygen. So that design is allowing it to be better at doing its job. The other big thing that our red blood cells did is they kicked out two of the largest organelles that you have within your cells. When we look at cell structure, the nucleus is the largest organelle that you have in your cells. The other one that is not the largest by size, but because most of our cells carry multiple mitochondria, they also take up a lot of room. So size-wise, they're not the biggest, but when you collectively put all of them together, because there's so many of them in most of our cells, they do take up a lot of space. So the red blood cells, once they hit maturity, they do two big things. They kick out the nucleus and they kick out the mitochondria. That again frees up a lot of space so that they can carry more oxygen. So we have a specific shape, and then we get rid of the things that are taking up the most space inside the red blood cell so that we can pack in as much oxygen as possible to get to all of those cells inside. Now, your typical red blood cell is going to only live, if you look on your packet, it says about 120 days. And that is because it is moving in and out of blood vessels, and the edges start to get worn and torn and damaged, and eventually it gets to the point it can't do its job anymore. So after about 120 days, once they are no longer functional, we do slough them off, and we get rid of them through our waste product. So a lot of times when we are eliminating solid waste from the body, it has a brown coloration. That is in two parts. Number one, it is somewhat in part from bile, which is a digestive enzyme we'll talk about in a few weeks. But then you have those dead red blood cells. And so because they are dead, they lose kind of that red coloration, they get the brown tone, and that is going to account for a majority of the color of the solid waste as it leaves our body. Now, in getting rid of the nucleus within the red blood cells, they do not go through mitosis like our other body cells. So mitosis is going to allow a cell to divide, and one cell becomes two, two becomes four. With losing their nucleus, the red blood cells can't do that. And so we have to generate red blood cells in a different way. They're actually produced within the bone marrow of our bones. And that is where the new ones are going to come from. And they are constantly having to be replenished. The other amazing thing about red blood cells is we lose about 1 million red blood cells every single minute. So when you think about the sheer volume of that and losing that many red blood cells within such a short period of time, and that your body is able to replace those and you don't really miss a beat, you don't notice it, that's a pretty amazing capacity that we are able to regenerate that volume of red blood cells on a consistent basis. All right, if you flip over to page 4, it talks about red blood cell counts. And if you look at the first one, this ties back into the volume as far as liters. Guys have roughly 6, women are going to have 4.5 to 5 as far as the overall amount of blood. But if you look at the red blood cell counts, this is a little bit different. This is the actual number of red blood cells that you would have if you looked at 1 cubic millimeter of blood. So a millimeter by a millimeter by a millimeter. If you were to count the amount of red blood cells in that space, a male is going to have roughly about 4.5 to just over 6 million red blood cells. A female is going to be just over 4 to about 5.5. And then depending on the age of the child, obviously if you're comparing a 4-year-old up to a 12-year-old, there's going to be a range, but they're about 4.5 to 5. Now, initially, I could tell you that information and I could walk away and not say too much more about it, but there's something very telling in that information. If you think about what red blood cells do, red blood cells carry oxygen to our cells. Oxygen is the main driving force behind the electron transport chain, where we produce ATP. ATP is the fuel that our cells use to do work. So if we start tying this all together, if you look at 1 cubic millimeter of male blood to 1 cubic millimeter of female blood, a male is going to potentially have 6 million red blood cells in that cubic millimeter. A woman at most is going to have 5.5. So a guy has more red blood cells in the same amount of space of female blood. What does that translate to? Take 2 track athletes, 1 female, 1 male. Have them run the 100-meter dash. Have them run a marathon. If you compare the times between a female and a male athlete, the male athlete, and I'm talking about adults, male athlete is typically going to have the faster times. That's not a slam on women. That is scientifically proven right here as to why it should happen that way. If I have more red blood cells, or if a male has more red blood cells in a cubic millimeter, that means more oxygen is getting delivered to the cells faster. If more oxygen is getting to the cells faster, they are producing more ATP. So if I'm doing a workout, if I am a guy running a 100-meter dash and I am using up ATP, but I am able to get more oxygen back to my cells faster, I can replenish that ATP. So I'm able to maintain, I'm able to recover faster than what a female is. So you would expect a guy to run faster times and have better times because that oxygen delivery is more efficient, the recovery is more efficient. And so, like I said, it's a scientific reason behind why we see that. The last slide that you have talks about the other components of blood. And the white blood cells on the left-hand side, it gives you the names of the different types of defending cells that we have within our system. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those guys right now. These actually come up in our lymphatic chapter, and so I want to hold off on those right now. We will come back to them. Just know for right now that your white blood cells, these guys are your defenders. If something gets into your system that is not supposed to be there, these are the cells that are going to be called into action to deal with it. Blood platelets, I kind of already talked about with you guys. Proper name for a platelet is a thrombocyte. I talked about the fact that they do stem from those broken cells, and then they are used to help stop bleeding. All right, if you go to the last page of your packet, it talks about the blood types. So within humans, there are 4 main types of blood. You have type A, type B, type O, and type AB. So within the blood types, the most common blood type that we have is type O blood. The rarest form of blood is going to be type AB. Now, with the blood types, I'm going to kind of hold off on this conversation. This lends itself to being drawn out, which I can't do in this particular setting. And so I want to make sure that I do that conversation justice. So I am going to hold off on that one as well for right now, and we will come back to it. So last week I'd asked to make sure that you guys always have your packets with you each week. Please make sure that this packet travels back with you when we meet on the 26th. So that moves us into the RH factor. So RH factor actually comes from an abbreviation from where this was first recognized. RH factor is a protein that some people have on their blood and some people do not have on their blood. Where it was first discovered was in monkeys, and it was found in a variety of monkeys known as the rhesus monkey, RHESUS. So the first 2 letters that you see there, RH, are a tribute to this monkey where this protein was first identified. Now, there is no benefit to having the protein or lacking the protein, but it does play a part in blood transfusions and who can give blood to who and have that done safely. So on the surface of a blood cell, there are tiny little things that are attached all over the place. We have carbohydrate flags. We talked about that back in first semester. You also have these protein flags. If you have these protein flags, you are Rh positive. If you lack the protein flags, you are Rh negative. So with the Rh factor, as I mentioned, if you are going to donate blood to somebody else, you have to make sure that you understand the Rh factor in order for that to be a safe exchange. And again, that kind of ties into our blood types, and I'll pull this all back together on the next time that we come as well. The pregnancies and how that impacts pregnancy will come up as well. So if you have You need to know the RH factor of mom and baby, because if they differ, mom's blood could actually attack baby. And the reason that we see it happen in the second pregnancy is because the first time mom is pregnant, if her and baby differ, mom is going to actually build antibodies at that time. The second time that mom is pregnant, if her and baby differ, that's when she has now those antibodies in place, and those antibodies would potentially impact baby. So we'll come back to all of that next time that we meet. Please make sure that you have this packet with you. So the last thing that I want to talk about is the classification of the blood vessels. So we have the heart, we have trillions of cells throughout our body. We have to make sure that we can get the blood to all the parts of our body. The blood vessels that we have are a networking system to get that blood distributed where it needs to go. And we have a variety of ways to transport that blood. You have the arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries, the venules, and the veins. So whenever blood is being carried away from the heart, that is going to be in an artery or an arteriole. So if blood is moving away from the heart, it is in one of those two blood vessels. If blood is making its way back to the heart, then it's going to be in a vein or a venule. Away from arteries, back to, it's coming through the veins. Now, you have to have a connection between the two. So if the arteries are taking it away, the veins are bringing it back. The capillaries are the junction between the two. So what happens is, right next to the heart, you have the largest arteries, and the big one is going to be the aorta, which comes directly out of the heart. So the aorta comes out of the left ventricle. It actually loops over the top of the heart, kind of like a horseshoe coming over the top of the heart, then runs down the backside through our core, down to our lower abdomen, and then it splits and starts to run down the legs. So you have the ascending aorta, which comes over the top of the heart, descending, which runs down through our thoracic cavity into the abdominal cavity before it splits. The aorta is the largest blood vessel that we have in the human body, and at its widest, if you were to take your thumbs and put your thumbs side by side, you are looking at the width of your aorta. It is a massive blood vessel, carries a huge amount of blood, and explains very easily why if somebody has damage to that aorta, if it ruptures or is torn, that you bleed out very, very quickly just because of how large it is. So as those arteries come out of the heart and start making their way out to the body, they need to get smaller so that they can actually get to their destination. We're trying to deliver oxygen to the cells. Cells are microscopic in size. They don't need arteries coming in direct contact with them. So as we move further away from the heart, the blood vessels will start to branch. And as they branch, they get smaller and smaller until they eventually transition from an artery into an arteriole. So an arteriole is a smaller version of an artery. And they continue to branch and get smaller and smaller, excuse me, until they become capillaries. Capillaries, as I mentioned earlier, are about the size of a single strand of hair. And when your blood is moving through capillaries, they are so small that your red blood cells actually have to travel in single file. There's not enough space for multiple blood cells to move through side by side. They have to go one right after the other. So we are talking about very small blood vessels, but that's exactly what we need to be able to get down to all the parts of our body and to all the cells that we have. If you are a visual person, the best example I can kind of give you is to think of a tree. You have the trunk of the tree, which would be the aorta, and then you get into the main limbs of the tree, and that would be the arterioles. And then when you get out into the smaller branches all the way out to the ends of the tree, that would be your capillaries. So as you continue to move away from the trunk and get out to the edges of the tree, you start to get smaller and smaller, branch down in size until you get to the small little twigs. Now, once the blood gets to the capillaries, We need to start bringing it back to the heart because we have to do that exchange of gases. We have to get more oxygen into the blood. We have to dump off the carbon dioxide that has been collected by the blood. And so as we make our way back to the heart, we're going to see just the opposite happen. We go from those capillaries, the capillaries will start to merge back together. And as they merge, if you guys have ever watched two drops of water come together, the two smaller drops, when they merge, they get larger in size. And that same thing happens with our capillaries. As two small capillaries merge back together, you're going to start to get larger blood vessels, which are your venules. As they continue to merge and come together, they will become veins, and then the veins are actually going to lead back into the heart itself. So with our blood, as it is being carried away from the heart, it's just come from the lungs, getting that oxygen level replenished. So your arteries carry blood that is high in oxygen. It also changes the color of the blood. So the more oxygen you have in the blood, the brighter red color it is. As your blood goes through your system, starts delivering oxygen to your cells, that oxygen level decreases and the blood color of the blood will change as well, and it becomes a deeper, darker red. So as that blood is coming back to the heart through the veins, the color has changed to a deeper color red, and the oxygen level has decreased. It's not depleted. In one trip through the body, you're using roughly 30% of your oxygen volume. So not all of it. There is still plenty left, but it's enough of a usage of that oxygen that we do need to replenish it and get it back up to 100%. So that is just a little bit about your blood vessels, how they work. Know that your arteries are going to carry high oxygenated blood and be bright red in color. Veins are going to have lower oxygenated blood and be darker in color. And the capillaries are going to be that connection point between the arteries and the veins.